Welcome to your deep dive.
Today we're really diving headfirst into a situation that's grabbing headlines all over the world. The conflict between Israel and Hamas. You've brought in some really compelling research, and I'm really interested to unpack why this matters, not just in the Middle East,
Right.
but to you directly,
Yeah.
even if you're, thousands of miles away.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this situation really underscores how interconnected our world really is. What might seem like a distant conflict really has ripple effects that reach, honestly, every corner of the globe.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because, like you said, it's a very complex situation, and it's easy to kind of
Absolutely.
gloss over some of the things that are happening, just even looking at some of the images. It's like, wow, this is really heavy stuff. And I think one thing that your research does a really good job of is that it really brings to the forefront the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
And that's something that I really wanted to make sure that we don't lose sight of.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest things is that we can get caught up in the headlines and kind of the political back and forth. But ultimately, at the heart of it, this is a devastating humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the casualties, although those numbers are absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. We're talking about families being displaced from their homes, the lasting trauma that this kind of conflict causes, just the struggle to access basic necessities.
Yeah.
Food, water, shelter.
Right.
These are things that we, I think, often take for granted, but are now a really dire situation for so many people.
Yeah, and and it's something that we see repeated, unfortunately, time and time again in these types of conflicts. But, this humanitarian crisis isn't confined to the region, right? It ripples outward, and it affects global dynamics in a few key ways. And one of those things that I really wanted to touch on that your research did a really good job of talking about is how different countries are kind of being forced to pick sides.
Exactly. And we see this playing out in real time with, for instance, Germany offering very strong support to Israel while you have Iran on the other side backing Hamas. And so this creates this very polarized environment, which puts immense pressure on international bodies like the UN to try to mediate. And one of the things that your sources kind of highlighted is that this is proving incredibly difficult in this particular situation.
Yeah, and I can see why, because, looking at this conflict in particular, it's definitely not a simple, two-sided issue.
Absolutely not.
Where it's like...
And there's so many layers to this.
Yeah, it's like, these two entities are at odds with each other. There's so much history here. There's so many different factions and players that it really does make it difficult, I think, for anyone to kind of step in and say, this is...
And have a solution.
Yeah, this is right.
It's going to work for everybody.
Yeah, and, and what's interesting, too, is that complexity, it bleeds into the economic sphere as well.
Oh, absolutely.
And, one of the things I think that a lot of our listeners might not realize is just how much this conflict can actually hit close to home, literally in their wallets. Have you noticed the recent jump in gas prices?
Oh, yeah.
It's crazy.
Impossible to ignore it.
Yeah, and you would think what's happening over there in the Middle East, how could that possibly affect me?
Right.
But the reality is it's directly linked to that instability in the region, right? That has a huge impact on global oil production, and so...
Absolutely, and it's a domino effect.
Yeah.
Right, so you have this conflict that's causing instability, which then impacts oil production, which then drives up prices globally.
Wow. See, honestly, I hadn't even connected those dots before, so thank you for that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, sometimes you got to follow the trail to really see the connections, but it's definitely there.
And you mentioned earlier, the UN struggling to kind of find a solution and step in. What does that mean for, say, the United States? Because obviously the U.S. has historically played a big role in the region. So how are they handling this?
Yeah, they're in a very tricky position. On the one hand, they're staunch allies with Israel, right? That's a long-standing relationship. On the other hand, there's this immense pressure on the U.S. as a global power to step in and really try to mediate and find a peaceful resolution. But as we've already discussed, this is not easy, given how deep-seated these issues are. And I think one thing that your research highlighted really well is this idea that global powers like the U.S., they have to walk this very, very fine line between balancing their own national interests with this very real need to try to broker a broader, more sustainable peace in the region.
It's a lot to process. Even just us talking about this today.
Oh, absolutely.
I feel like there's so much to unpack. And then if you layer on top of that, there's a whole other aspect.
The whole other can of worms.
Yeah, of the information battleground, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because that's something that you really keyed in on in your research about how we have to be so careful and really aware of the dangers of misinformation, especially now, right? I mean, with the speed at which news, or I should say fake news, can spread online,
it's unbelievable. It's like wildfire.
It's terrifying.
It's really scary how quickly things can spread, and then people take it as gospel, when in reality it's been, just distorted or taken out of context or even completely fabricated.
And it makes it really hard to even know what to trust these days.
Exactly. I mean, we are constantly bombarded with information and updates, and it's coming from all different directions and very often with conflicting narratives. And so it makes it really, really difficult to kind of sift through that and discern what information is actually accurate and what is, intentionally or unintentionally misleading.
And your source mentioned a particularly concerning trend of videos being manipulated to push specific agendas. And
It's scary, especially because video is such a powerful medium.
it's so believable.
Right, because it feels like, oh, I'm seeing with my own eyes, so it must be true, right? But the reality is that technology has advanced so much that it's easier than ever to manipulate that footage and create a completely different narrative.
So with all of that in mind, because that's scary. That's a lot to consider. How do we, even just as individuals, right? Not even talking about world leaders or, these larger organizations. How do we as individuals navigate all of this? Because we're not on the ground there, but we're clearly not immune
Not at all.
to the effects of what's happening.
I think it starts with, honestly, a really, really healthy dose of self-awareness. Acknowledging that we all bring our own biases to the table when we're consuming information. And so we have to be very mindful of that. And then it's about actively seeking out diverse viewpoints. I think that's one of the most important things, is to not just stay in your own little echo chamber where you're only hearing information that confirms what you already believe, but actually going out and seeking out information from reputable sources that offer different perspectives, even if you don't agree with them. And then, always maintain that healthy skepticism. Question everything. Look for evidence-based reporting. Look for sources that are transparent about their methods. And remember that just because a headline is really catchy or really dramatic doesn't necessarily mean that it's an accurate reflection of reality.
That's so true, and it's easy to get caught up in those clickbaity headlines.
Oh, yeah.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening, and I will say that what started as just headlines, something kind of happening in the background, has now, I think, really come into focus. And I don't know, even just preparing for this, reading through the research that you sent over, it just feels much more real, much more impactful now.
It is, and it's a good reminder that these are not just events that are happening in a vacuum, right? These have real-world consequences for real people. And it prompts us all to ask these larger questions of, what role do we want to play in this globalized world that's grappling with these incredibly complex issues? How can we be better informed? How can we be more empathetic? How can we be more proactive in seeking peaceful resolutions? These are big questions that are worth pondering and discussing and debating as we all continue to kind of learn and engage with the world around us.
You've given us a lot to think about, so thank you for that.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to our deep dive.